The wind howled through the gaps in the makeshift auction house walls like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bitter promise of another harsh Montana winter. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, blanketing the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge in a thick, unforgiving white that made even the shortest journey treacherous. Inside the converted barn, oil lamps flickered against the December gloom, casting dancing shadows across the faces of men who had traveled from miles around despite the weather. Eliza Morrison stood on the crude wooden platform, her hands bound behind her back with rough hemp rope that chafed against her wrists. The thin cotton dress she wore, her only decent garment, provided little protection against the cold that seeped through every crack in the building. Her dark hair, once carefully pinned, now hung loose around her shoulders, framing a face that bore the hollow look of someone who had already endured too much at 19 years of age. "What am I bid for this fine specimen?" bellowed Jeremiah Hawthorne, the auctioneer whose whiskey-roughened voice carried over the murmur of the crowd. "Healthy, young, and strong enough for any man's household needs. Starting bid is $50. Eliza kept her eyes fixed on a point just above the heads of the assembled men, refusing to meet their appraising gazes. She had learned long ago that showing fear only made predators hungrier. Her father, Samuel Morrison, stood near the back of the room, his hat pulled low over his eyes, unable or unwilling to watch what his debts had forced him to do. 3 months ago, when the bank had come calling for the money he owed on failed cattle ventures and poor harvests, he had looked at his daughter with the same expression a man might wear when calculating the worth of livestock. "$60, called out a voice from the middle of the crowd. Eliza recognized him as Tom Bradley, a widower who owned a struggling farm outside town. She had seen him watching her at church services with eyes that made her skin crawl. $75. This from Jake Patterson, a man known for his quick temper and quicker fists. His last wife had died under circumstances that were never quite explained to anyone's satisfaction. The bidding continued, each number feeling like another nail driven into the coffin of her freedom. Eliza closed her eyes and tried to transport herself somewhere else, back to the days when her mother was still alive, when their small farmhouse had been filled with laughter and the smell of fresh bread, before disease and debt had stolen everything that mattered. $100, the voice cut through the auction house like a blade, causing conversations to die mid-sentence. Eliza's eyes snapped open, searching for the source of the bid that had just doubled the previous offer. In the back corner of the room, partially hidden by shadow, stood a man she had never seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors in all manner of conditions. His dark beard was neatly trimmed, and his clothes, while simple, were well made and clean. What struck her most were his eyes, pale blue and unreadable, studying her with an intensity that was somehow different from the leering gazes of the other men. "Did I hear $100? Hawthorne asked, his voice barely concealing his excitement at the unexpected windfall. "Going once." $125, Tom Bradley countered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. The stranger stepped forward into the lamplight, and Eliza could see him more clearly now. There was something about him that suggested danger, not the crude, threatening presence of men like Patterson, but the quiet lethality of a mountain cat. When he spoke again, his voice was calm and measured. $200, gold. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. $200 was more money than most of these men saw in 6 months. The stranger reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, the soft clink of coins audible in the sudden silence. $200, Hawthorne repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Do I hear 225? The auction house remained silent. Even Patterson, for all his bluster, seemed to recognize that he was outmatched. The stranger's pale eyes never left Eliza's face, and she found herself unable to look away, caught in a gaze that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $200. The sound of Hawthorne's gavel hitting the podium felt like a death knell. Eliza's knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself to remain standing. She would not show weakness. Not now. Not in front of these men who saw her as nothing more than property to be bought and sold. The stranger approached the platform with steady, measured steps. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, evidence of squinting against sun and snow. His hands, when he reached up to help her down from the platform, were calloused and strong but surprisingly gentle. He cut the ropes binding her wrists with a sharp knife that appeared and disappeared so quickly she almost missed it. "Name's Jonas McGraw," he said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "And you are?" "Eliza," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her wrists burned where the ropes had been, and she rubbed them absently. Jonas nodded and handed the leather pouch to Hawthorne, who counted out the gold coins with the reverence of a man handling holy relics. The transaction completed. Jonas turned back to Eliza and gestured toward the door. "We'll be leaving now." As they made their way through the crowd, Eliza caught sight of her father. Samuel Morrison stood with his hat in his hands, looking older than his 50 years. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something that might have been regret flickering in his gaze. But then he looked away, and she understood that whatever bond had once existed between them had been severed as cleanly as her binding ropes. Outside, the snow was still falling, and the wind cut through her thin dress like knives. Jonas led her to a sturdy-looking wagon hitched to 2 powerful draft horses. In the back were supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, and other necessities for what looked like an extended journey. He helped her up onto the wooden seat and then climbed up beside her, taking the reins in his hands. "Where are we going?" she asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Jonas clicked his tongue at the horses, and they began to move, their hooves crunching through the snow. "My cabin, up in the mountains." "How far?" "Far enough." They rode in silence through the darkening streets of Cedar Ridge, past the saloon where light and laughter spilled out into the winter night, past the general store and the church where she had prayed so many times for deliverance that never came. As they left the town behind and began climbing into the foothills, Eliza realized she might never see civilization again. The trail wound upward through thick stands of pine and aspen, the trees heavy with snow that muffled sound and made the world feel dreamlike and unreal. Jonas drove with the confidence of someone who knew these paths well, even in the dark. Occasionally, he would glance at her, but he made no attempt at conversation. After what felt like hours, they finally stopped at a clearing where a log cabin sat nestled against the mountainside. It was larger than she had expected, with a stone chimney from which smoke was already rising. Jonas helped her down from the wagon and led her to the front door, which he unlocked with a heavy iron key. The interior was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a fire crackling cheerfully in the grate. There was a kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, shelves lined with preserves and dried goods, and a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs. Everything was clean and well-maintained, speaking of a man who took care of his possessions. Jonas hung his coat on a peg by the door and gestured for her to do the same with her shawl. Then he turned to face her, and for the first time since the auction, she saw something other than calm indifference in his expression. There was a hardness there, a determination that made her take an involuntary step backward. "I want to make something clear," he said, his voice low and steady. "I didn't buy you for decoration or to keep house. I have specific expectations." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "And what might those be?" Jonas moved closer, close enough that she could smell the pine and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. When he spoke, his words fell like stones into still water. "Bear my sons or rot in this cabin, the choice is yours." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had expected many things, demands for cooking and cleaning, perhaps worse, but this cold, calculated pronouncement was somehow more terrifying than any crude advance would have been. There was no passion in it, no heat, just the simple statement of terms that brooked no negotiation. "And if I refuse?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Jonas studied her for a long moment, and she thought she saw something flicker in his pale eyes. Pain, perhaps, or regret. But when he answered, his voice remained impassive. "Then you'll find out how long a Montana winter can be." He turned away then, moving to bank the fire for the night. "There's a room upstairs. It has a lock on the inside of the door. I won't force myself on you, but I won't pretend this is anything other than what it is." Eliza stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, her mind reeling. She had expected brutality, expected to be used and discarded like so many women in her position. But this was different, more honest, perhaps, but also more chilling. Jonas McGraw was not a man driven by base desires, but by some deeper need that she couldn't yet understand. As she climbed the narrow stairs to the room that would serve as either her sanctuary or her prison, Eliza Morrison made a silent vow. She would survive this, whatever it took. And when the spring thaw came, she would find a way to reclaim the freedom that had been stolen from her in that auction house. Behind her, she could hear Jonas moving about the cabin, the sounds of a man going through the familiar rituals of ending another day. But sleep, she knew, would be a long time coming for either of them. Eliza woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood, the rhythmic thunk, thunk, thunk echoing off the mountain walls that surrounded the cabin. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the small window of her room, revealing a space that was sparse but clean. A narrow bed with rough wool blankets, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a wooden chest that served as both storage and seating. The lock on the inside of the door was solid iron, and she had turned it the moment Jonas had left her alone the night before. She had barely slept, every creak of the cabin settling in the cold making her start. But as dawn approached and exhaustion finally claimed her, she had dozed fitfully, dreaming of auction blocks and pale blue eyes that seemed to see too much. Now, pressing her face to the frost-covered window, she could see Jonas in the yard below, splitting logs with methodical precision. He had removed his coat despite the cold, and she could see the play of muscles across his broad back as he worked. There was something almost meditative about his movements, as if the repetitive task brought him a peace that conversation could not. The view beyond him took her breath away. Mountains stretched as far as the eye could see, their snow-covered peaks gleaming like jewels against the azure sky. Pine forests carpeted the lower slopes, broken only by the occasional meadow or rocky outcropping. It was beautiful and terrible in its vastness, a reminder of just how isolated they were. The nearest neighbor, if there was one, could be days away. A soft knock at her door made her jump. "Coffee's ready," Jonas called through the wood. "And breakfast, if you want it." Eliza's stomach clenched with hunger. She had eaten nothing since a meager midday meal the day before. but the thought of facing him across a table made her hesitate. Still, she couldn't hide in this room forever. She unlocked the door and descended the narrow stairs, finding Jonas at the kitchen table with 2 steaming cups and a plate of fried eggs and bacon. "How do you take your coffee?" he asked without looking up from his own cup. "With milk, if you have it." He rose and fetched a small pitcher from the cold cellar, pouring a measure into her cup. The domestic normalcy of the gesture was jarring after his stark pronouncement the night before. Eliza sat across from him, noting that he still wore the simple gold band on his left hand. A wedding ring, she realized, though there was no sign of any woman in this cabin. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind whistling through the eaves. Eliza studied her surroundings more carefully in the daylight. The cabin was well built and thoughtfully arranged. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, tools, and preserves. A rifle hung above the fireplace, and she could see a pistol in a holster hanging from a peg by the door. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone by choice and had learned to be self-sufficient. "Where's the nearest town?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. "Cedar Ridge is 50 miles southeast," Jonas replied, not looking up from his plate. "But the trail's impassable in winter, now won't clear until April, maybe May." 50 miles. The number hit her like a physical blow. Even if she could somehow escape, she would never survive such a journey in winter conditions. She was as trapped as if he had chained her to the wall. "Have you lived here long?" 4 years. He finished his coffee and stood to clear the dishes. "Built this place myself." "All alone?" For the first time, she saw a flicker of something cross his face. Pain, perhaps, or loss. Not always. The wedding ring gleamed in the morning light as he washed the dishes in a basin of heated water. Eliza found herself wondering about the woman who had once shared this isolated existence with him. What had happened to her? Had she died? Or had she simply been unable to bear the loneliness and left? After breakfast, Jonas donned his coat and announced he was going to check the snares he had set for small game. "Don't try to leave," he said matter-of-factly. "The cold will kill you long before you reach anywhere safe." When he was gone, Eliza explored the cabin more thoroughly. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor. A stone hearth dominated one wall, with a cooking range built into one side. Shelves held an impressive collection of books, everything from practical manuals on farming and animal husbandry to volumes of poetry and philosophy. It was the library of an educated man, someone who valued learning despite his remote circumstances. In one corner, she found a small desk with paper and ink. A partially written letter lay open, addressed to someone named Thomas in Chicago. The handwriting was precise and educated, the content dealing with a business matter involving timber rights. Jonas McGraw, it seemed, was not the simple mountain hermit she had initially taken him for. A wooden staircase led to the upper floor, which contained her small room and another larger chamber that was clearly Jonas's. The door stood ajar, and she could see a neatly made bed, a wardrobe, and another washstand. On the bedside table sat a small framed photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She was pretty in a wholesome way, with fair hair and a lace collar at her throat. This, then, was the previous occupant of the cabin. But it was what she found in the corner that made her heart clench with sudden understanding. A wooden cradle, beautifully crafted but never quite finished. The rockers were carved with intricate designs, and the headboard bore the beginning of what looked like it would have been a family name. But the project had been abandoned, left to gather dust in a room that should have been a nursery. The sound of Jonas returning sent her scurrying back downstairs. But the image of that unfinished cradle remained burned in her mind. Whatever tragedy had befallen him, it involved more than just the loss of a wife. The days settled into a routine. Jonas would rise before dawn to tend to the animals: 2 horses, a milk cow, and a small flock of chickens housed in a sturdy coop behind the cabin. Eliza would prepare breakfast with the supplies he provided, and they would eat together in relative silence. He was not a talkative man, but neither was he cruel. He simply seemed to exist in a state of careful emotional distance, as if feeling too much might break something fundamental within him. Afternoons, he would disappear into the woods to hunt or check trap lines, always returning before dusk with small game or firewood. Eliza used these hours of solitude to plan. She memorized the layout of the cabin, noted where he kept the weapons, and studied the surrounding terrain from every window. There had to be a way out, some path that would take her back to civilization before the cold claimed her. But even as she planned her escape, she found herself drawn into the strange rhythm of their shared existence. Jonas was not the brutish captor she had expected. He was quiet and respectful, never entering her room without permission, never making demands beyond her presence at meals. In the evenings, he would read by the fire while she mended clothes or simply stared into the flames, both of them locked in their own private worlds. It was during one of these evening silences that she finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. What was her name? Jonas looked up from his book, his pale eyes unreadable in the firelight. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Sarah, he said finally. Sarah Elizabeth McGraw. She was beautiful. Yes. He closed the book and set it aside. She was, What happened to her? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. When Jonas finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She died in childbirth, the baby with her, winter of 78. The stark words hit Eliza like physical blows. She thought of the unfinished cradle upstairs, of the careful distance he maintained from all emotion, of the way he still wore his wedding ring like a shield against the world. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. Jonas stared into the fire, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "We were snowed in for 3 days. Nothing I could do but watch them both slip away. Been alone up here ever since." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Eliza understood now why he had bought her, why he spoke of sons with such cold determination. He was trying to fill a void that had been carved out of his heart 4 years ago, trying to replace what death had stolen from him. "Is that why you brought me here?" she asked softly. "To give you what she couldn't." His eyes snapped to hers, and for a moment she saw past the careful mask he wore. There was pain there, deep and abiding, but also something else, a desperate hope that he was trying to keep buried. "I told you why I brought you here," he said gruffly, rising from his chair. "Nothing's changed." But as he banked the fire for the night and climbed the stairs to his room, Eliza knew that everything had changed. She was no longer just a prisoner in this mountain cabin. She was a woman trying to understand a man whose heart had been broken so thoroughly that he had retreated from the world entirely, seeking solace in isolation and the promise of sons who might somehow heal wounds that went soul deep. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind howl around the cabin, Eliza Morrison began to understand that escape might not be her only option. But the alternative, staying, trying to build something real from the ashes of both their broken lives, seemed almost more terrifying than fleeing into the frozen wilderness. The mountains kept their secrets, and the snow continued to fall. For 3 weeks, Eliza had watched and waited, memorizing every detail of Jonas's routine. He rose before dawn to tend the animals, chopped wood after breakfast, and disappeared into the forest most afternoons to check his trap lines or hunt. The pattern never varied, and neither did his return time, always before the sun touched the western peaks, always with the quiet efficiency of a man who had survived these mountains long enough to respect their dangers. But on this particular morning in late January, something was different. Jonas stood at the kitchen window longer than usual, studying the sky with the intense focus of someone reading weather signs invisible to her untrained eye. The air had that peculiar stillness that often preceded a storm, and even from inside the cabin she could sense a change in the atmosphere. "I'll be gone longer today," he said without turning from the window. 3, maybe 4 days. There's a trap line up near Eagle's Rest that I haven't checked since before the last storm. Eliza's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady as she poured his coffee. 4 days is a long time in this weather. The traps will be full and I need the pelts. He turned to face her, his pale eyes serious. There's enough food to last you a week and plenty of firewood stacked by the door. Don't let the fire die out. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, more time than he had ever given her alone, enough to make a real attempt at escape. Jonas gathered his supplies with methodical care: dried meat, coffee, ammunition, extra blankets, and his heaviest coat. He checked his rifle twice and strapped snowshoes to his pack. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at her. "Eliza," he said quietly, "don't do anything foolish while I'm gone." The words weren't quite a warning, but they carried weight nonetheless. She met his gaze steadily, giving nothing away. "I'll be here when you return." It wasn't exactly a lie. She intended to be somewhere when he returned, just not where he expected. Jonas studied her face for a long moment, then nodded and stepped out into the cold morning air. She watched from the window as he strapped on his snowshoes and set off toward the northeast trail, his figure growing smaller until the forest swallowed him entirely. Eliza forced herself to wait 2 full hours, using the time to gather supplies for her own journey. She had been carefully hoarding food over the past weeks, a few strips of dried meat here, some hardtack there. Nothing that would be missed but enough to sustain her for several days. She found Jonas's spare coat hanging in the back of the wardrobe, far too large but warmer than anything she owned. In the bottom drawer, she discovered a pair of men's boots that, while oversized, could be stuffed with rags to fit well enough for walking. From the kitchen, she took a small knife, matches wrapped in oiled cloth, and a tin cup. She filled a canvas bag with snow that would melt into drinking water as she walked. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The most challenging part was the snowshoes. Jonas had a second pair hanging in the barn, but she had never used such contraptions before. After several minutes of fumbling with the leather bindings, she managed to strap them on, though her first steps were clumsy and uncertain. The plan was simple: follow the main trail southeast toward Cedar Ridge until she reached the trading post that Jonas had mentioned in passing, a way station about 20 miles from the cabin where trappers and hunters sometimes stopped for supplies. From there, she could hopefully find someone willing to take her the rest of the way to town. The first few miles went better than she had dared hope. The trail was well marked, and the snowshoes, once she got the hang of them, made travel possible if not comfortable. The forest was beautiful in its winter dress, pine boughs heavy with snow creating a cathedral-like canopy overhead. Her breath formed crystals in the cold air, and the only sounds were the whisper of her snowshoes on the packed snow and the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere above the trees. But as the afternoon wore on, the sky began to darken with ominous clouds, and the wind picked up, sending snow devils swirling across the trail. The temperature dropped noticeably, and what had started as a crisp winter day began to take on the menacing quality of an approaching storm. Eliza pressed on, driven by the knowledge that every step took her closer to freedom. She tried not to think about Jonas returning to find her gone, tried not to imagine the expression on his face when he discovered her betrayal. He had saved her from far worse fates at that auction, had treated her with more respect than she had any right to expect. But she could not, would not, accept the life he had mapped out for her. By late afternoon, the first snowflakes began to fall, and, at first, they were large and lazy, drifting down like feathers. But within an hour, the snow was falling harder, and the wind had risen to a howl that bent the trees and made it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. Eliza realized with growing alarm that she could no longer make out the trail markers. The path that had seemed so clear that morning was disappearing under the fresh snowfall, and landmarks that she had tried to memorize were becoming obscured by the swirling white. She pushed forward anyway, telling herself that the trail had to be here somewhere, that she just needed to keep going southeast. But as darkness began to fall and the storm intensified, she was forced to admit the terrible truth. She was lost. The blizzard hit with the full fury of a Montana winter storm. Snow fell so thickly that she couldn't see her own hands when she held them out in front of her. The wind cut through Jonas's heavy coat as if it were made of paper, and ice began to form on her eyelashes and around the edges of the scarf she had wrapped around her face. Eliza stumbled through the forest, no longer following any trail but simply trying to find shelter from the storm. The snowshoes that had been her salvation that morning now felt like anchors, making every step an exhausting effort. Her legs burned with fatigue, and her lungs ached from breathing the frigid air. She found a large pine tree with low-hanging branches and huddled beneath it, trying to escape the worst of the wind. But even in this meager shelter, the cold was relentless. She could feel it seeping through her boots, numbing her toes and fingers despite her thick gloves. The snow she had brought for water had frozen solid in her pack, and her food supplies seemed woefully inadequate against the storm's fury. As the night wore on, Eliza began to understand why Jonas had warned her about the dangers of the Montana winter. This wasn't just cold, it was a living thing, malevolent and hungry, seeking to drain the warmth from her body 1 degree at a time. She found herself growing drowsy despite her fear, and some distant part of her mind recognized this as a warning sign. She forced herself to move, to stomp her feet and swing her arms, anything to keep the blood flowing. But her movements were becoming sluggish, and the simple act of standing required enormous effort. The storm showed no signs of abating, and she was beginning to lose the battle against the cold. Time became meaningless in the white chaos of the blizzard. She might have been huddled under that tree for hours or minutes, she couldn't tell. All she knew was that she was getting colder, and the drowsiness was becoming harder to fight off. When she finally stumbled away from her inadequate shelter, she had no idea which direction she was going. The storm had disoriented her completely, and she was operating on pure instinct now. The animal desire to keep moving, to find warmth and safety somewhere in the endless white. She fell several times, each tumble into the deep snow sapping more of her remaining strength. The snowshoes became tangled in fallen branches, and she wasted precious energy freeing them. Her face was so numb from the cold that she could barely feel the ice forming around her mouth and nose. It was during one of these falls that she saw it, a faint glimmer of light through the swirling snow. At first, she thought it was a hallucination, her mind creating hope where none existed. But as she forced herself to her feet and stumbled toward it, the light grew stronger and more real. The cabin materialized out of the storm like a vision from a dream. For a moment, her heart soared with the thought that she had somehow found the trading post, that her desperate journey had succeeded against all odds. But as she drew closer, recognition dawned with crushing finality. She was back at Jonas's cabin. Somehow, in her blind wandering through the storm, she had made a complete circle. All her struggle, all her suffering, had brought her right back to where she started. The irony would have been laughable if she hadn't been so close to freezing to death. Eliza collapsed against the cabin door, her strength finally exhausted. She couldn't feel her hands well enough to turn the handle, and her legs wouldn't support her weight any longer. The storm raged around her with undiminished fury, and she found herself drifting into the dangerous sleep that comes just before the final cold. She never heard the door open, never saw Jonas appear in the doorway like an avenging angel. The first thing she was aware of was warmth, blessed, life-giving warmth, and strong arms lifting her from the snow. "What in God's name were you thinking?" Jonas's voice seemed to come from very far away, but she could hear the anger in it, and something else, fear, perhaps, or relief. He carried her inside and set her down near the fire, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he began stripping away her wet clothes. She wanted to protest, to maintain some shred of dignity, but she was shivering too violently to speak, and her fingers were too numb to help. "Foolish, stubborn woman," he muttered as he wrapped her in warm, dry blankets and began chafing her hands and feet to restore circulation. "You could have died out there, nearly did." The feeling returning to her extremities was agony, pins and needles that made her gasp and bite her lip to keep from crying out. But gradually, the warmth penetrated deeper, and the violent shivering began to subside. Jonas brought her hot coffee laced with something stronger, supporting her head as she sipped it slowly. His touch was gentle despite his obvious anger, and she could see the concern in his pale eyes as he watched her face for signs of frostbite. "Why?" he asked finally, when her shivering had stopped and some color had returned to her cheeks. "Why did you try to run in weather like this?" Eliza met his gaze, seeing her own exhaustion reflected there. He looked as if he hadn't slept, and she realized that he must have returned early from his trapline, must have arrived to find her gone and immediately set out to search for her in the storm. "Because I had to try," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold. "Because I won't just accept what you've decided for my life." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his hands still warming hers between his palms. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "You nearly died tonight, Eliza. I found you seconds before you would have frozen to death on my doorstep." The weight of that truth settled over her like a blanket. She had gambled everything on a desperate bid for freedom and lost, nearly paying the ultimate price for her defiance. But even now, wrapped in Jonas's blankets and warmed by his fire, she couldn't bring herself to regret the attempt. "I had to try," she repeated, and something in her voice must have convinced him of her sincerity. Jonas nodded slowly and released her hands. "I know," he said quietly. "But next time you want to leave, wait for spring. The mountains won't forgive mistakes like that twice." As he banked the fire for what remained of the night and settled into the chair beside her makeshift bed on the floor, Eliza closed her eyes and tried to process what had happened. She had run toward freedom and found only death waiting in the storm. She had been saved by the very man she was trying to escape, who had risked his own life to find her in the blizzard. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the cabin walls, there was warmth and safety and something else, the first fragile thread of understanding between two people who had both learned what it meant to lose everything that mattered. The morning after the blizzard dawned clear and brilliant. The world outside transformed into a crystalline wonderland that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Eliza woke to find herself still wrapped in blankets by the fireplace, her body stiff but warm. The events of the previous night felt like fragments of a fever dream, the desperate flight through the storm, the creeping cold that had nearly claimed her life, and Jonas's strong arms carrying her to safety. She could hear him moving about in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of coffee being prepared and wood being fed to the stove. When she sat up, wincing at the soreness in her muscles, he appeared with a steaming cup in his hands. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, though she caught the flicker of concern in his pale eyes. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," she admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warmth spread through her hands and up her arms, a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. Jonas nodded and returned to the kitchen without another word. But she noticed that he had added an extra measure of milk to her coffee, exactly the way she preferred it. It was a small thing, insignificant perhaps, but it suggested that he had been paying attention to her preferences in ways she hadn't expected. Over the next few days, she began to notice other small changes. When she complained about the hard wooden chair at the kitchen table, Jonas spent an evening carving cushioned grooves into its seat and adding a thin pillow stuffed with pine needles and soft moss. When she mentioned that the lamp in her room cast shadows that made reading difficult, he repositioned it without being asked and added a small mirror to better reflect the light. Most surprising of all was the morning she came downstairs to find a small wooden comb lying beside her coffee cup. It was beautifully crafted, carved from what looked like cherry wood and polished to a warm gleam. The handle was decorated with delicate engravings of mountain wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and columbine that she recognized from her mother's pressed flower collection. "You made this?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth surface. Jonas glanced up from his breakfast, a faint flush coloring his weathered cheeks. "Your hair was getting tangled," he said gruffly. "Figured you could use something better than your fingers." Eliza stared at the comb, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness behind the gift. She had expected many things from this arrangement: demands, expectations, perhaps even kindness of a sort, but not this careful attention to her comfort and dignity. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's beautiful." He nodded curtly and returned to his meal, but she caught the pleased expression that briefly crossed his features before he could hide it. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their usual silence, Eliza found herself studying Jonas more carefully. She had initially seen him as her captor, a mountain man who had bought her for his own purposes. But the man who sat across from her, reading a book of poetry by lamplight, was more complex than she had given him credit for. "What are you reading?" she asked, breaking the comfortable quiet. Jonas looked up, seeming surprised by the question. "Wordsworth," he replied, showing her the worn leather cover. "The Prelude." "I know that poem," Eliza said, feeling a flutter of excitement at finding common ground. "My mother used to read it to me. There was a boy, you knew him well, ye cliffs and islands of Winander. Fair seed time had my soul, and I grew up fostered alike by beauty and by fear." Jonas continued, his voice taking on a softer cadence as he quoted the familiar lines. "For the first time since arriving at the cabin," Eliza smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "My mother was a teacher before she married my father. She believed that education was the one thing that could never be taken away from a person. She sounds like a wise woman. She was Eliza's smile faded as memories of her mother's final illness washed over her. She died when I was 16. Consumption. After that, everything changed. Jonas closed his book and set it aside, giving her his full attention. Tell me about her. The simple request opened a floodgate of memories that Eliza hadn't allowed herself to revisit in years. She told him about Mary Morrison's herb garden, about the lessons taught at the kitchen table, about summer evenings spent reading aloud on the front porch. She spoke of her mother's gentle hands and patient voice, of the way she had made their simple farmhouse feel like a place of learning and love. She would have liked you, Eliza said impulsively, then immediately regretted the words. But Jonas didn't mock her or point out the absurdity of such a statement. Instead, he simply nodded. I would have liked to meet her, he said quietly. The conversation drifted naturally to other topics. Books they had both read, places they had traveled, dreams they had once harbored. Eliza learned that Jonas had attended university in Chicago before coming west, that he had been trained as an engineer before the mountains called to him. He spoke of building railroads through impossible terrain, of the satisfaction that came from imposing order on the wilderness. What made you leave all that behind? She asked. Jonas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Sometimes a man needs to start over, he said finally. Sometimes the only way to heal is to find a place where the past can't follow. Eliza understood that he was talking about more than just his career change. She was beginning to realize that Jonas McGraw was a man running from ghosts, just as she was a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Is that what you found here? Healing? I thought I had, he admitted. Until Sarah died. Then I realized that some wounds never heal. They just go deeper underground. The name hung in the air between them, a reminder of the woman whose memory still filled this cabin like a presence. Eliza felt a strange pang of something that might have been jealousy, followed immediately by shame. Sarah McGraw had been dead for 4 years. It was foolish to resent a ghost. Do you ever think about leaving? She asked. Going back to civilization? Jonas shook his head. This is my home now. These mountains, this cabin, they're all I have left of the life Sarah and I built together, and I won't abandon that. The conviction in his voice was absolute, and Eliza realized that whatever future awaited her, it would be here in this remote valley, far from the world she had known. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting. As the days passed, their evening conversations became a cherished ritual. They talked about everything and nothing, the books on Jonas's shelves, the wildlife that visited the clearing around the cabin, the changing patterns of weather and season. Eliza found herself looking forward to these moments of connection, when the careful walls they both maintained seemed to lower just enough to let real communication through. Jonas began to share stories of his life in the mountains, encounters with bears and mountain lions, the challenge of surviving blizzards that lasted for weeks, the peculiar satisfaction of living entirely by one's own skills and knowledge. He spoke of the trap lines that provided income, of the garden that would feed them through the summer, of the rhythms of a life lived in harmony with the natural world. It's not an easy life, he warned her one evening. The isolation can drive some people mad. The winters are long and hard, and there are dangers that city folk never imagine. But you love it, Eliza observed. I can hear it in your voice when you talk about this place. Jonas looked surprised by her perception. Yes, he admitted. I do love it. There's a freedom here that I never found anywhere else. A man can be exactly who he is, without pretense or expectation. "And what about a woman?" Eliza asked quietly. The question caught him off guard, and she saw him struggle with an answer. "I suppose," he said slowly, "that would depend on the woman." Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and Eliza felt something shift in the air between them. It wasn't desire exactly, though there was an element of that. It was recognition, an acknowledgement that they were two people finding their way toward an understanding that neither had expected. "I've been thinking," Jonas said carefully, "about what I said that first night, about your choices." Eliza's heart began to beat faster. "What about them? Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe there's room for negotiation?" The word hung between them, loaded with possibilities that Eliza was afraid to examine too closely. What kind of negotiation? Jonas rubbed his bearded jaw, choosing his words carefully. "I still want what I told you I wanted, a family, sons to carry on my name, to carry on. But maybe the getting there doesn't have to be as cold as I made it sound." Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. They were treading on dangerous ground now, moving away from the careful neutrality that had characterized their relationship thus far. "I'm not Sarah," she said quietly. "I won't pretend to be her, and I won't try to replace her in your heart." "I'm not asking you to," Jonas replied. "Sarah is gone. What I'm talking about is something different, something that belongs to us." The words carried a weight of possibility that made Eliza's breath catch. She had been so focused on escape, on reclaiming her old life, that she hadn't seriously considered what it might mean to build a new one. But sitting here in the warm glow of the firelight, listening to this complicated man open his heart in careful increments, she found herself wondering if perhaps there was another path forward. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to think about what that might mean." Jonas nodded, as if he had expected no other answer. "Spring is still months away," he said. "We have time." That night, as Eliza lay in her narrow bed listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin settling around her, she found herself thinking not about escape, but about possibility. Jonas McGraw was not the man she would have chosen for herself, but he was proving to be far different from the cold mountain man she had first taken him for. He was educated and thoughtful, capable of both gentleness and strength. He read poetry by firelight and carved wooden combs with patient skill. He had respected her refusal to share his bed, even as he made clear his ultimate intentions. And perhaps most importantly, he had risked his own life to save hers when her desperate flight into the storm had nearly killed her. Was it possible that this arrangement, born of desperation and necessity, might grow into something real? Was it possible that she could find happiness in this remote valley, far from everything she had ever known? Eliza didn't have answers to these questions. But for the first time since Jonas had carried her from that auction house, she found herself willing to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was hope to be found in the most unlikely of places. Outside her window, the mountains stood silent and eternal under their blanket of stars, keeping their ancient secrets and waiting patiently for spring to reveal what new life might grow from the seeds of winter's harsh lessons. It was while searching for extra blankets in the upstairs storage chest that Eliza discovered Sarah's belongings. The lid creaked open to reveal carefully folded clothing, each piece wrapped in lavender sachets that still held their fragrance after 4 years. There were dresses of simple but fine fabric, a Sunday bonnet with silk ribbons, and delicate undergarments that spoke of a woman who had taken pride in her appearance despite the isolation of mountain life. Eliza lifted a blue wool dress from the chest, holding it up to the light streaming through the small window. Sarah had been taller than her, with a more generous figure. but the craftsmanship was exquisite. Every seam was perfectly straight, every button sewn with care. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in tissue paper, lay a wedding dress of ivory silk, yellowed with age but still beautiful. She made most of her clothes herself. Jonas's voice from the doorway made Eliza jump, nearly dropping the blue dress. She hadn't heard him come up the stairs, hadn't realized he was watching her rifle through his dead wife's possessions. Heat flooded her cheeks as she began to fold the dress with trembling hands. "I'm sorry," she stammered. I was looking for blankets, and I didn't mean to." "It's all right." Jonas stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. "I should have shown you where they were instead of letting you stumble across them like this." He moved to the chest and lifted out a thick quilt, its pattern of interlocking rings worked in deep blues and greens. "Sarah made this the winter before she died. Said it would keep our children warm." His voice caught slightly on the last word, and Eliza felt her heart clench in sympathy. "She was very talented," Eliza said softly, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. "Everything is so beautifully made." Jonas nodded, carefully folding the wedding dress and placing it back in the chest. "She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. Said it was important for a woman to create beautiful things, even in a place like this." They stood together in the small room, surrounded by the tangible remnants of a life cut short. Eliza could almost feel Sarah's presence, the ghost of a woman who had loved this man and dreamed of filling this cabin with children and laughter. "Why do you keep them?" she asked gently. "Doesn't it hurt to see these things every day?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the lid of the chest. "At first, yes, but now. They're all I have left of her. Getting rid of them would be like letting her die all over again." Eliza understood the sentiment, but she also recognized the danger in it. Jonas was holding on to the past so tightly that he couldn't fully embrace the present, couldn't see the possibility of a future that didn't revolve around replacing what he had lost. "She wouldn't want you to stop living," Eliza said carefully. "No woman who loved you would want that." Jonas's eyes snapped to hers, sharp and defensive. "You didn't know her. You don't know what she would want." "You're right," Eliza agreed. "I didn't know her. But I know what it's like to lose someone you love. And I know that the dead don't want the living to bury themselves alongside them." The truth of her words hung in the air between them, challenging and uncomfortable. Jonas stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the war being fought behind his pale eyes, the desperate desire to cling to his grief warring with a growing recognition that perhaps it was time to let go. "Come with me," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "There's something else you should see." He led her down the hall to his bedroom, stopping before the corner where the unfinished cradle sat gathering dust. In the daylight, she could see more details of its construction, the careful joinery, the loving attention to every curve and angle. It was a work of art, created by hands that had trembled with anticipation for the child who would never sleep in it. "I started this the day Sarah told me she was with child," Jonas said, kneeling beside the cradle and running his fingers over the smooth wood. "Worked on it every evening by lamplight, planning how I would finish it once the baby came. I was going to carve the name on the headboard, add rockers with little animals dancing around the edges." Eliza knelt beside him, studying the beautiful craftsmanship. She could see where he had begun to carve what looked like a rabbit, its ears barely sketched in the wood. "Why didn't you finish it?" "After they died, I couldn't bear to touch it. Every time I looked at it, I saw what might have been, what should have been." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I told myself I'd complete it someday, when the pain wasn't so fresh. But the years passed, and it just sat here, a monument to everything I'd lost. Eliza reached out and touched the unfinished carving, feeling the roughness where Jonas's chisel had stopped mid-stroke. "It's not too late," she said softly. "You could still finish it." Jonas looked at her sharply. "For what purpose? There's no child to sleep in it." "Not yet," Eliza said, her heart pounding at her own boldness. "But there could be." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Jonas stared at her, and she could see the moment when understanding dawned in his eyes. She wasn't talking about some abstract future child. She was talking about them, about the possibility of what they might create together. "You said you wouldn't try to replace Sarah," he said slowly. "I'm not talking about replacing her," Eliza replied, her voice gaining strength. "I'm talking about honoring her memory by building something new, something that belongs to us." Jonas was quiet for so long that Eliza began to fear she had overstepped, had presumed too much. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "You would do that? Stay here, have children, build a life in this wilderness?" Eliza considered the question carefully. A month ago, the idea would have been unthinkable. But now, after weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations, after seeing the gentle care with which Jonas had nursed her back to health, the prospect seemed less like imprisonment and more like choice. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm still trying to understand what I want, what I'm willing to accept. But I think there might be room in your heart for someone new, if you're willing to make space." Jonas reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Sarah was my first love," he said quietly. "The love of my youth, when everything seemed possible and the world was full of promise. But you're right. She wouldn't want me to stop living." He paused, studying their joined hands. "What I feel for you is different, quieter perhaps, but no less real. Built on respect and growing trust rather than the passion of youth." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes at the honesty in his words. This wasn't a declaration of desperate love, but something more mature and sustainable, the acknowledgement that what they were building together had value and potential. "I'm not asking you to love me the way you loved her," she said. "I'm just asking if you think you could learn to love me for who I am." Jonas lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I think," he said slowly, "that I already am." The confession hit her like a physical blow, unexpected and overwhelming. She had been prepared for many things, but not for this quiet declaration from a man who chose his words as carefully as he chose his paths through the wilderness. "Jonas," she whispered, not knowing what else to say. He released her hand and turned back to the cradle, running his palm over the smooth headboard. "If we're going to do this, if we're going to try to build something real together, then I need to finish what I started. Not for Sarah and the child we lost, but for us and the children we might have." Eliza nodded, understanding the significance of the gesture. Completing the cradle would be more than just finishing a woodworking project. It would be Jonas's way of closing one chapter of his life and opening another. "Will you help me?" he asked. And the simple request felt like a proposal of sorts. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'd like that." Over the following days, they worked together in the quiet hours after dinner, Jonas guiding her hands as she learned to use the carving tools. She was clumsy at first, her city-soft hands unused to the delicate work, but gradually she began to understand the rhythm of the craft. Jonas was a patient teacher, showing her how to follow the grain of the wood, how to make clean cuts that would stand the test of time. As they worked, they talked about the future they might build together. Jonas spoke of expanding the cabin, adding rooms for the children they hoped to have. Eliza described the garden she wanted to plant come spring, the herbs and vegetables that would supplement their diet and provide medicines for minor ailments. "My mother taught me about healing plants," she said one evening as she carefully shaped the ear of a wooden rabbit. "She said every woman should know how to tend the sick and injured." "That knowledge would be valuable here," Jonas replied, adding detail to a tiny carved fox. "The nearest doctor is in Cedar Ridge, and that's too far to be useful in an emergency." It was during one of these conversations that Eliza finally found the courage to voice the question that had been troubling her. "What happens when spring comes, Jonas? What if I decide I can't stay?" He paused in his carving, considering her words carefully. "Then you'll be free to go," he said finally. "I won't hold you against your will. And if I choose to stay?" Jonas set down his tools and looked at her directly. "Then we'll be married properly, by a preacher if we can find one, or by declaration if we can't. You'll be my wife in truth, not just in name." The word wife sent a shiver through Eliza that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. It implied intimacy, commitment, a sharing of lives that went far beyond their current careful dance around each other. "And children?" she asked softly. "When you're ready," Jonas replied, "when we both are. I won't rush you into something you're not prepared for." The promise in his words was both comforting and terrifying. Eliza had never been with a man in the way that mattered, had never experienced the physical intimacy that would be required to fulfill the role he was asking her to play. But as she watched Jonas's strong hands shape the wood with patient skill, she found herself wondering what it would be like to trust him with more than just her safety. "I need you to know," she said quietly, "that I've never... That is, I don't have experience with..." Jonas looked up from his work, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I know," he said gently. "I could tell. And I'm glad that when the time comes it will be something we discover together. Something that belongs only to us." The tenderness in his voice made her eyes blur with unshed tears. This was not the cold, transactional arrangement she had feared. This was a man offering her partnership, respect, and the promise of gentleness as they navigated the uncertain territory of marriage and intimacy. As winter deepened around them and the cradle slowly took shape under their careful hands, Eliza began to understand that she was faced with a choice that went far beyond simple survival. She could wait for spring and attempt to return to a world that had already rejected her. Or she could choose to build something new with a man who was proving himself worthy of her trust. The decision, she realized, was entirely her own to make. And for the first time since that terrible day at the auction house, Eliza Morrison felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful morning quiet like gunshots. Eliza looked up from the bread dough she was kneading, her heart immediately racing at the unexpected intrusion. In the 2 months she had been at the cabin, no one had come calling. The isolation that had once felt like imprisonment now felt like sanctuary, and the idea of strangers arriving filled her with dread. Jonas appeared in the kitchen doorway, his rifle already in his hands. His face was grim, the relaxed contentment that had begun to characterize their mornings replaced by the hard alertness of a man who had survived these mountains by never taking chances. "3 riders," he said quietly, peering through the window. "Coming up the main trail." Eliza wiped the flour from her hands and moved to look over his shoulder. Through the trees, she could make out the figures of 3 men on horseback, riding single file up the narrow path. Even at a distance, There was something purposeful about their approach that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Do you recognize them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonas shook his head, but his grip on the rifle tightened. "Could be trappers heading north or prospectors looking for mineral claims, but most folk know to give this place a wide berth." As the riders drew closer, Eliza could see them more clearly. The man in the lead was large and rough-looking, with the kind of face that suggested he was no stranger to violence. His companions were cut from similar cloth, hard men with cold eyes and weapons prominently displayed. These were not casual travelers or lost hunters. "Get upstairs," Jonas ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "Stay away from the windows and don't come down until I call for you." But Eliza found herself unable to move, frozen by a terrible suspicion that was growing stronger with each passing second. There was something familiar about the lead rider. Something in the way he sat his horse that triggered a memory she desperately wanted to forget. The men dismounted in the clearing before the cabin, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold morning air. Jonas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready, projecting the kind of quiet confidence that made smart men think twice about causing trouble. "Morning," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. "You gentlemen lost?" The lead rider pushed back his hat, revealing a scarred face that Eliza recognized with a jolt of pure terror. Bill Crawford, one of Harrison Blackwood's men, a brute who had made his interest in her clear during the weeks leading up to the auction. His presence here could mean only one thing. "Not lost," Crawford replied, his voice carrying an undertone of threat. "Looking for someone, actually. Name's Bill Crawford, and I ride for Harrison Blackwood of Cedar Ridge." Jonas's posture didn't change, but Eliza could see the subtle shift in his stance that suggested he was preparing for trouble. "Don't know any Harrison Blackwood. You're a long way from anywhere. Crawford grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "We're looking for a woman, young thing, dark hair, about 19 years old, goes by the name of Eliza Morrison. Never heard of her." "Now see, that's interesting," Crawford said, stepping closer to the porch. "Because word is you bought yourself a woman at auction back in December. Paid good money for her, from what I hear." Jonas raised the rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at Crawford, but making its presence known. "My business is my own. Crawford, I suggest you and your men move along." "Can't do that, friend." Crawford's hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Mr. Blackwood has made a generous offer for the woman. $500 gold, more than you paid for her. I'd wager. The woman you're looking for isn't for sale." Crawford's grin widened. "Everything's for sale at the right price. Mr. Blackwood, he's a patient man, but he's also a persistent one. The girl belonged to him first, you see, promised to him in marriage before her daddy sold her to pay his debts." Eliza felt sick at the lies rolling so easily off Crawford's tongue. Harrison Blackwood had never been promised anything, had never been more than a creditor circling like a vulture around her family's misfortune. But she knew how these men operated, how they twisted truth to serve their purposes. "Like I said," Jonas replied, his voice remaining steady despite the mounting tension, "I don't know anything about any woman. You're wasting your time here." Crawford exchanged glances with his companions, and Eliza could see the decision forming in their eyes. They hadn't ridden all this way to be turned away by one man with a rifle, no matter how determined he seemed. "Why don't we just take a look around?" Crawford suggested, his hand now openly resting on his weapon. "Make sure you're not hiding anything you shouldn't be." "You'll do no such thing." Jonas raised the rifle to his shoulder, the barrel now clearly pointed at Crawford's chest. This is my land, and you're not welcome on it. Ugh. For a moment, the tableau held, three armed men facing one, the morning air crackling with the potential for violence. Eliza knew that Jonas was outnumbered, that even his superior position and evident skill might not be enough against three desperate men. The thought of him being hurt or killed because of her was unbearable. Before she fully realized what she was doing, Eliza found herself walking out onto the porch. Jonas shot her a sharp look of warning, but she ignored it. Stepping up beside him with her chin raised and her shoulders squared. "I'm Eliza Morrison," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the clearing. "And you can tell Harrison Blackwood that I'm exactly where I choose to be." Crawford's eyes lit up with triumph. But there was something else there too, a hunger that made Eliza's skin crawl. Well, well, there she is, just as pretty as Mr. Blackwood said she'd be. "You heard her," Jonas said, his rifle never wavering. "She's here by choice. Now get off my land." Crawford laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Choice? That's rich. Girl's been kidnapped, held against her will by some mountain hermit. Mr. Blackwood is just trying to rescue her from a bad situation." "Is that what you call it?" Eliza stepped forward, anger overriding her fear. "Rescue? Harrison Blackwood is a bully and a coward who thinks money gives him the right to own people. I was never promised to him, never belonged to him, and I never will." "That's not how Mr. Blackwood sees it," Crawford replied, his hand moving to his gun. "He's invested considerable time and resources in you. Miss feels he's owed something for his trouble." "He's owed nothing," Eliza said firmly. "And I'm not going anywhere with you." Jonas moved slightly, positioning himself more directly between Eliza and the three men. The ladies made her position clear. "I suggest you respect it." Crawford's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Look here, mountain man, Mr. Blackwood is offering good money, more than fair value. Take the deal and everyone walks away happy." "No deal," Jonas replied flatly. "Then maybe we'll just take what we came for." Crawford's hand closed around his pistol grip. 3 against 1 ain't the best odds, friend." 3 against 1, maybe, Jonas agreed, his voice calm as ice. "But you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" "You're standing in the open, and I've got the high ground and a rifle. Even if you manage to kill me, at least one of you won't be riding home to collect your pay." Crawford hesitated, clearly doing the mathematics of survival in his head. He was obviously used to intimidating people through superior numbers and the threat of violence. But Jonas was presenting a different kind of challenge entirely. "Besides," Jonas continued, "there's something else you should consider." "What's that?" Jonas's smile was thin and cold. "The woman you're trying to take is my wife, and I take a dim view of men who threaten my family." The word wife hit Eliza like a physical blow. It wasn't true. They weren't married, hadn't even discussed marriage beyond their tentative conversations about the future. But she understood what Jonas was doing, claiming her publicly in a way that would carry weight even with men like Crawford. "Your wife?" Crawford's eyes narrowed. "Funny. I don't see no ring on her finger." Without hesitation, Eliza reached out and took Jonas's free hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that spoke of intimacy and commitment. "My husband and I prefer simple ceremonies," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "We were wed by declaration, as is legal in this territory." Crawford looked back and forth between them, clearly trying to assess whether they were telling the truth. But there was something in their united stance, in the way they stood together against his threat, that must have been convincing. "Mr. Blackwood won't like this," he said finally. Mr. Blackwood's preferences are no concern of mine, Jonas replied. Now I'll ask you one more time to leave my land. The next time I ask, it'll be with bullets instead of words. For a long moment, the standoff continued. Then Crawford spat into the dirt and gestured to his companions. This ain't over, he said, mounting his horse with obvious reluctance. Mr. Blackwood don't give up easy. Neither do I, Jonas replied calmly. As the three men rode away, disappearing back down the mountain trail, Eliza felt her knees go weak with relief. The confrontation was over, but the implications of what had just happened were only beginning to sink in. She had publicly declared herself Jonas's wife, had chosen him over the life that Harrison Blackwood would have forced upon her. Jonas lowered his rifle and turned to face her, his pale eyes searching her face. Are you all right? Eliza nodded, though she was still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Thank you for standing up to them, for protecting me. You didn't need protecting, Jonas said quietly. You held your own out there. Showed more courage than most men would have. They stood together on the porch, the morning sun warming their faces as they watched the last traces of dust settle on the trail. The mountain silence had returned, but something fundamental had changed between them. They had faced a threat together, had presented a united front against those who would have separated them. Did you mean it? Jonas asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. What you said about choosing to be here. Eliza looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the stranger who had bought her at auction, but the man who had risked his life to find her in a blizzard, who had carved her a wooden comb and shared his evening poetry, who had just faced down 3 armed men rather than let them take her away. Yes, she said simply. I meant it. Jonas nodded slowly, as if absorbing the weight of her words. And when you called me your husband, heat rose in Eliza's cheeks, but she didn't look away. That felt right too. In that moment, it felt true. It could be true, Jonas said quietly. If that's what you want. Not because of what those men threatened, but because it's what we both choose. Eliza thought of Harrison Blackwood and his twisted sense of ownership, of the life of servitude and misery that would have awaited her in Cedar Ridge. Then she thought of the unfinished cradle upstairs, of quiet evenings by the fire, of the possibility of building something real and lasting with this complicated, honorable man. I think, she said slowly, that it already is true. Maybe not legally, not yet, but in all the ways that matter. Jonas smiled then, the first genuinely happy expression she had seen from him since her arrival. Mrs. McGraw, he said formally, offering her his arm. Shall we go inside? I believe we have a future to discuss. As they walked into the cabin together, Eliza felt a sense of completion that she had never expected to find. She had been sold at auction like a piece of property, but in choosing to stay, in choosing Jonas, she had reclaimed her freedom in the most fundamental way possible. Outside, the mountain stood eternal and unchanging, but within the walls of the small cabin, 2 people who had found each other against all odds began to plan the life they would build together. 3 days after Crawford's visit, Jonas returned from checking his northern trapline with more than just rabbit pelts. His face was grim as he entered the cabin, and Eliza could see the tension in his shoulders as he hung his coat by the door. What is it? She asked, looking up from the shirt she was mending. Over the past weeks, she had learned to read his moods, to distinguish between the ordinary fatigue of mountain life and the deeper concern that now etched lines around his pale eyes. Jonas reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased from travel. He handed it to her without a word, his jaw set in a hard line that spoke of barely contained anger. Eliza unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, and her heart sank as she saw her own face staring back at her from a crude but recognizable sketch. The words below the image were printed in bold letters that seemed to leap off the page. Wanted Eliza Morrison for theft of family jewelry. $500 reward, contact Harrison Blackwood, Cedar Ridge. The paper felt like lead in her hands as she read the charges. According to the poster, she had stolen a valuable necklace and matching earrings that had belonged to her deceased mother. Jewelry that Harrison Blackwood claimed she had taken without permission when she fled from a lawful engagement. "It's all lies," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Every word of it." Jonas sat down heavily in the chair across from her, his eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me what really happened." Eliza set the poster aside with shaking hands, her mind racing back to those terrible final days before the auction. "The jewelry was my mother's, left to me when she died. It was the only thing of value I had left, the only connection to her memory. When my father told me about the auction, I took it and hid it." "Where?" "I buried it near my mother's grave the night before they took me to town. I couldn't bear the thought of it being sold along with everything else, of losing the last piece of her I had left." Jonas leaned forward, his expression intense. "So you never actually took it with you?" "No. It's still there, buried under the old oak tree beside the cemetery fence. I was hoping." Her voice broke slightly. "I was hoping that someday I might be able to go back and retrieve it." "And Blackwood knows about this jewelry?" Eliza nodded miserably. "He came to the house several times during those final weeks, making offers to buy our debts. He saw me wearing my mother's necklace once and commented on how valuable it looked. I think he always intended to claim it as part of whatever arrangement he made with my father." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, studying the wanted poster with the careful attention of a man who understood the power of legal documents, even fraudulent ones. $500 is a lot of money," he said finally. "Enough to bring every bounty hunter and law officer within 200 miles looking for you." The implications of his words hit Eliza like a physical blow. She had thought that her confrontation with Crawford had ended the immediate threat, but this changed everything. Harrison Blackwood wasn't just sending his own men after her. He was making her capture profitable for anyone willing to try. "What am I going to do?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "Even if I could prove the jewelry is still buried where I left it, who would believe my word against his?" Jonas stood and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered peaks that surrounded their valley. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and measured. "There might be a way to clear your name, but it would mean taking considerable risks." "What kind of risks?" He turned back to face her, and she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before, a hardness that spoke of experience with violence and danger that went far beyond surviving in the wilderness. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about my past," he said quietly. "Before I came to these mountains, before I met Sarah, I worked for the federal government." Eliza felt her breath catch. "What kind of work?" "I was a deputy U.S. Marshal assigned to the territorial court. My job was to track down men who used their wealth and influence to escape justice, men like Harrison Blackwood." The revelation hit her like a thunderbolt. Jonas McGraw wasn't just a mountain man or a former engineer. He was a lawman, someone with experience in exactly the kind of corruption that Blackwood represented. "You were a marshal?" she repeated, struggling to reconcile this new information with the quiet, gentle man she had come to know. Jonas nodded, his expression grim. For 6 years, from 72 to 78, I specialized in cases involving fraud, extortion, and abuse of power. Men who thought their money could buy them immunity from the law. What happened? Why did you stop? Jonas moved back to his chair, his movements heavy with the weight of memory. The job changes a man. You see too much corruption, too many good people crushed by those with power and connections. After Sarah died, I couldn't face going back to that world. The mountains seemed like a better place to heal. Eliza stared at him, seeing him in an entirely new light. The careful way he had assessed Crawford and his men, the quiet confidence with which he had faced down 3 armed riders. It all made sense now. Jonas McGraw was a man who had spent years confronting dangerous criminals. And those skills hadn't disappeared just because he had chosen a different life. "Do you still have authority?" she asked. "Could you arrest Blackwood?" Jonas shook his head. "I resigned my commission when I came here, but I still have contacts. Men I trust who might be willing to listen if I brought them solid evidence." "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that could only come from someone who knew where to look and how to find it." Jonas leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. Blackwood didn't become wealthy and powerful without leaving a trail of victims behind him. If we could find some of those victims, document his crimes, we might be able to build a case that would not only clear your name but put him where he belongs. The word "we" sent a shiver through Eliza that had nothing to do with the cold. "You would do that? Risk going back to that life for my sake?" "Not just for your sake," Jonas replied quietly. "For justice. Men like Blackwood think they can do whatever they want to innocent people without consequences. They're usually right, but not always." Eliza felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. The idea of clearing her name, of being free from the constant fear of capture, was almost too wonderful to believe. But she also understood the dangers they would be facing. What would we have to do? Jonas stood and moved to his desk, pulling out a sheet of paper and a pen. "First, we'd need to dig up that jewelry you buried and prove it was never stolen. That would undermine the foundation of his charges against you. But that would mean going back to Cedar Ridge. Eventually, yes, but not until we have everything we need to make our case airtight." He began writing, his pen moving with quick, sure strokes. "I still have friends in the marshal's office in Helena. I could write to them, explain the situation, ask them to start looking into Blackwood's business dealings." Eliza watched him work, marveling at the transformation that had come over him. The quiet mountain man had been replaced by something harder and more focused, a man who understood how to fight corruption and wasn't afraid to do so. How long would something like that take? Months. Probably. Maybe longer. Building a case against a man like Blackwood requires patience and careful documentation. But if we can prove he's been using fraudulent charges to intimidate people, it would be worth the wait. Jonas finished writing and set down his pen, turning to face her with an expression of complete seriousness. "I need you to understand what we'd be getting into. Eliza, Blackwood won't take kindly to being investigated. He'll fight back, and he won't be particular about how he does it." "You mean he might come after us?" "He might try. Men like him usually prefer to work through the legal system when they can, but they're not above using more direct methods when necessary." Eliza thought of Crawford and his companions, of the cold hunger she had seen in their eyes. More men like the ones who came here. Worse, probably. Professional killers who would make Crawford look like a choir boy. Jonas's voice was matter-of-fact, but she could see the concern in his eyes. "I won't lie to you, there would be real danger involved." Despite her fear, Eliza felt a spark of determination growing in her chest. She had spent too many months running and hiding, allowing herself to be defined by other people's lies and threats. The idea of fighting back, of taking control of her own fate, was intoxicating. "What's the alternative?" she asked. "Spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when someone will recognize me from that poster? We could disappear deeper into the mountains, find a place so remote that no one would ever think to look for us." Eliza shook her head. "That's not living, Jonas. That's just another kind of prison." Jonas smiled then, an expression of pride and admiration that warmed her more than any fire could. "I was hoping you'd say that. So we fight. We fight," he confirmed, "but we do it smart, and we do it right. No rushing in like heroes in a dime novel. We build our case carefully, gather our evidence, and make sure we have the law on our side before we make any moves." Eliza felt a mixture of fear and excitement coursing through her veins. She was about to embark on something far more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. But she wouldn't be doing it alone. She would have Jonas beside her, a man who knew how to fight corruption and had the skills to see it through. "When do we start?" she asked. Jonas moved to the fireplace and fed the wanted poster to the flames, watching as her sketched face curled and blackened in the heat. "We start now. I'll write to my contacts tonight. Start the process of building our case. Come spring, when the trails are passable again, we'll begin gathering the evidence we need." As the poster burned to ash, Eliza felt as if a weight was being lifted from her shoulders. For the first time since that terrible day at the auction house. She wasn't just surviving. She was planning to reclaim her life. "There's one more thing," Jonas said, turning back to her with a serious expression. "If we're going to do this, if we're going to take on Blackwood and his organization, then I need to know you're committed. Once we start down this path, there won't be any turning back." Eliza met his gaze steadily, seeing in his pale eyes the same determination that was growing in her own heart. "I'm committed," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Jonas nodded, as if he had expected no other answer. "Then we'd better get to work. We have a long fight ahead of us, and it starts tonight." As they settled down to plan their campaign against Harrison Blackwood, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just the hope of survival, but the hope of justice, of clearing her name and building a future free from the shadows of other people's lies. Outside, the winter wind howled through the peaks, but inside the cabin, two people who had found each other against all odds began to plan their war against corruption and greed. It would be dangerous. It would be difficult, but they would face it together. Spring arrived with the sudden violence of a mountain awakening. One day the world was locked in winter's grip, and the next, water was running everywhere, cascading off the cabin roof, rushing down the mountainsides in impromptu streams, turning the snow-packed trails into rivers of mud and possibility. The air itself seemed to vibrate with new life, filled with the sounds of returning birds and the distant crack of ice breaking up on the higher peaks. Eliza stood at the kitchen window, watching Jonas work in what would soon be their garden. He was breaking ground that had been frozen solid for months, turning over earth that smelled rich and dark with promise. The sight of him working in the warming sunshine, his sleeves rolled up and his movements sure and purposeful, filled her with a contentment she had never expected to find. The past weeks had brought changes to both of them. Subtle but profound shifts that spoke of a relationship moving from necessity to choice, from survival to something deeper and more lasting. They had finished the cradle together, its carved animals now dancing around the edges in a celebration of life and hope. It sat in the corner of what had once been Sarah's memory room, transformed now into a nursery waiting for the children they planned to bring into the world. Jonas looked up from his work and caught her watching him, his face breaking into the slow smile that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. He set down his spade and walked toward the cabin, and she met him at the door, automatically handing him the cup of water she had prepared. "Getting warm out there," he said, accepting the drink gratefully. "Ground's softer than I expected. We'll be able to plant earlier than I thought." Eliza nodded, but her attention was focused on something else entirely. The warming weather meant that the trails would soon be passable, that their isolation would end and the outside world would once again become accessible. It also meant that the time for decisions had arrived. "Jonas," she said quietly, "we need to talk." He set down the cup and studied her face, reading the seriousness in her expression. "About what?" "About us. About what happens next." Jonas was quiet for a moment, then nodded toward the chairs by the fire. They had had many important conversations in those chairs over the winter months, working through the complicated process of two wounded people learning to trust each other. Now, as they settled into their familiar positions, Eliza felt the weight of all those conversations pressing down on her. "The trails will be clear soon," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Clear enough for travel." "Yes," Jonas agreed. "Another week or two, and a person could make it down to Cedar Ridge without too much trouble." The words hung between them, laden with implication. This was the moment they had both been building toward all winter, the point where theory would become reality, where promises would be tested against the harsh light of actual choice. "You told me once that when spring came I would be free to choose," Eliza said softly. "Free to stay or free to go." Jonas's hands tightened slightly on the arms of his chair, but his voice remained steady. "I did. And I meant it." "I know you did." Eliza leaned forward, studying his beloved face in the firelight. "But I need you to know that my choice isn't about freedom from you anymore. It's about freedom to be with you." Something flickered in Jonas's pale eyes. Relief, perhaps, or joy carefully held in check. "And what choice have you made?" Eliza reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, feeling the calluses from months of shared work, the strength that had protected her and the gentleness that had won her heart. "I choose you, Jonas. I choose this life, this place, this future we're building together. Not because I have to, but because I want to." Jonas was quiet for so long that Eliza began to fear she had presumed too much, had read more into their growing closeness than was actually there. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Are you certain? Once we take this step, once we commit to each other fully, there won't be any going back. This is a hard life, Eliza. Isolated and sometimes dangerous. There will be times when you'll wonder if you made the right choice." "I'm already wondering about choices," Eliza replied with a small smile. "I'm wondering why it took me so long to realize that what I was looking for wasn't out there in the world I used to know. It was here, with you. In this place we've made our own." Jonas brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The same gesture he had made months ago when they first began to understand what they might mean to each other. But now it carried a different weight, the promise of commitment rather than the tentative exploration of possibility. "Then we need to make it official," he said quietly. "Not just the words we spoke to Crawford, but something real and binding." Eliza felt her heart begin to beat faster. "You mean marriage?" "I mean everything that comes with marriage. The legal bond, the physical union, The promise to build a life together no matter what obstacles we face. The mention of physical union sent heat rushing through Eliza's veins. They had been dancing around the subject all winter, acknowledging it in careful conversations but never confronting it directly. Now, with spring opening the world around them, it was time to address the reality of what their commitment would mean. "I've never," she began, then stopped, embarrassed by her own inexperience. "I know," Jonas said gently, "and I'm glad. It means that what we share will be ours alone. Something that belongs only to us." He stood and moved to the small desk where he kept his papers, returning with a sheet of clean parchment and his pen. In the Montana Territory, a marriage by declaration is legally binding if it's properly witnessed and recorded. We can write our own vows, speak them before God in this mountain wilderness, and be as truly married as if we stood before a preacher in the finest church. Eliza watched as he began to write, his careful script filling the page with words of commitment and promise. When he finished, he handed her the pen. "Add whatever you think should be there," he said. "This document will be the foundation of our life together." Eliza read through what he had written, marveling at the formal yet heartfelt language that declared their intention to be husband and wife, to share their lives and fortunes, to support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. At the bottom, she added her own vows, promises to be his partner in all things, to bear his children if God willed it, to help him heal from the losses of his past while building something new and lasting. When they had both signed their names at the bottom, Jonas carefully folded the document and placed it in the small strongbox where he kept his most important papers. "There," he said quietly. "It's done. As of this moment, you are Mrs. Jonas McGraw, and I am your husband." The words sent a shiver through Eliza that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. She was married now, truly and completely, to this man who had bought her at auction and ended up claiming her heart instead. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonas moved to stand before her chair, offering his hand. "Now we go upstairs, and I show you what it means to be my wife in every sense of the word." Eliza felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anticipation, but she took his hand without hesitation. Whatever fears she might have had about the physical aspects of marriage, she trusted Jonas completely. He had been patient and gentle with her heart. She knew he would be the same with her body. He led her up the stairs to his room, their room now, where moonlight streamed through the windows and fell across the bed where they would begin their married life together. Jonas turned to face her, his hands gentle as he cupped her face. "Are you frightened?" he asked softly. "A little," Eliza admitted, "but not of you. Never of you." Jonas smiled and leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, then her cheeks, then finally her lips. It was their first real kiss, tender and sweet and full of promise for the intimacy to come. "We'll take it slowly," he murmured against her lips. "We have all the time in the world." The next morning dawned bright and clear, the first truly warm day of spring. Eliza woke in Jonas's arms, her body tender but content, her heart full of wonder at the night they had shared. He had been everything she had hoped for and more, patient and gentle, helping her navigate the awkward transition from maiden to wife with a consideration that made her love him even more deeply. "Good morning, Mrs. McGraw," he said softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Good morning, husband," she replied, marveling at how natural the word sounded. They lay together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of spring awakening outside their window. But eventually, practical concerns intruded, and they rose to begin their first day as a truly married couple. Over breakfast, they talked about the future with a new sense of purpose and commitment. Jonas had received a reply from his contacts in Helena, confirming that they were willing to investigate Harrison Blackwood's affairs if provided with sufficient evidence. The process would take time, but it offered real hope for clearing Eliza's name and bringing her tormentor to justice. "We'll need to be careful," Jonas warned as they planned their approach. "Blackwood won't take kindly to being investigated, and he has resources we don't." "We have something he doesn't," Eliza replied confidently. "We have the truth, and we have each other." Jonas smiled at her words, but his expression remained serious. "The truth doesn't always win, Eliza. Sometimes power and money triumph over justice." "Not this time," she said firmly. "This time, we're going to make sure justice prevails." After breakfast, they returned to work on the garden, side by side in the warm sunshine, as they planted seeds that would feed them through the coming year. Eliza found herself thinking about other kinds of seeds, the possibility of children who would grow up in this beautiful, isolated place, surrounded by love and the values that she and Jonas shared. "Do you think we'll have children soon?" she asked as they worked. Jonas paused in his planting and looked at her with an expression of tender hope. "Would you like to?" "Yes," Eliza replied without hesitation. "I want to fill this cabin with laughter and love, to give you the family that was taken from you." "Not just for me," Jonas said quietly. "For us. For the life we're building together." That evening, as they sat by the fire with the completed cradle between them, Eliza felt a deep sense of completion. She had traveled so far from the frightened young woman who had stood on that auction platform in Cedar Ridge. That girl had been lost and powerless, at the mercy of men who saw her as property to be bought and sold. The woman she had become was different, stronger, more confident, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. She had found not just a husband but a true partner, someone who respected her mind as much as he desired her body, who was willing to fight for their future together. "No regrets?" Jonas asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. Eliza looked around the cabin that had become her home, at the man who had become her heart, at the life they were building together from the ashes of their separate losses. "None," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I belong." Outside, the last snow was melting from the high peaks, sending rivers of clear water rushing toward the valleys below. Spring had come to the mountains, bringing with it the promise of new growth, new life, and new possibilities. Inside the warm cabin, by the light of the fire they had tended together through the long winter months, Mr. and Mrs. Jonas McGraw sat hand in hand, watching the flames dance and planning the future they would build together, a future born not of desperation or circumstance, but of choice, commitment, and a love that had grown slowly and surely through the patient work of two hearts learning to trust each other completely. The mountains would always be wild and dangerous. The life they had chosen would always be challenging, but they would face it all together. And in the end, that was all that mattered.